And now that's done. So I'm going to be talking about some work that was really spearheaded by a postdoc who works in my lab and also Laura Schultz and Josh Tenenbaum's lab. Her name is Sydney Levine, and I want to make sure to give due credit to her insights in this line of work. I want to begin with a moral imperative that I think has been at the forefront of certainly many of our minds in America over the last year, which is the obligation to vote. Many people, empirical studies have found, feel that it is in fact a moral obligation. That's their personal feeling, is that it's a moral obligation to vote in major national elections. And yet that presents something of a mystery for theories of moral psychology, at least in their current form. So many of you, I know, aren't aficionados of moral psychology, but here are some of the predominant ways that we have of thinking about how ordinary people decide what's right and wrong. They pay attention to the consequences of your behavior, but the problem is that in a major national election, your vote almost certainly makes no difference. They think that we should follow rules, but of course, to skip voting in the United States is legal. They think that you should pay attention to norms, that is what people around you are doing. But many people in many elections, the majority of Americans actually skip voting. And they sometimes rely on their moral emotions. And yet there's nothing particularly emotionally arousing about skipping voting. But if you ask ordinary people, why would it be wrong, therefore, to skip voting in a major national election? Sooner or later, you're likely to hear something like this. Well, what if everybody did that? Then there really would be a big problem. And that's an example of a moral principle that actually has a really distinguished history in philosophy, known as universalization. So this is most famously associated with Kant. The idea is, if you want to know whether it's right or wrong for you personally to do something, ask whether you could universalize that principle to everybody in the relevant population. And if it would be okay for everyone to do it, then it's okay for you to do it as well. But that theme also shows up in consequentialist theories, especially rule consequentialist theories, in contractualist theories and contractarian theories. It's one of the most consistent themes, always in different surface forms, but picking the same underlying logic throughout moral philosophy. It has relatively little history of study in moral psychology, however. The only real exception is the work of Lawrence Kohlberg, who is a giant in the field of moral development in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But interestingly, Kohlberg argued, Kohlberg was famous for arguing that children and young adults go through a regular progression of moral development. And he characterized this principle of universalization as showing up only in the highest stages of moral development, which, he argued, virtually nobody attained. Perhaps 10 or 15% of adults. And largely the people who attained that highest stage got there because in one way or another, they had actually been exposed to Kantian philosophy. But in contrast to that possibility that this is a rare and intellectual attainment of highly educated people, I can go to my local bookstore and there's literally a book for kindergartners titled "What If Everyone Does That?" So one possibility is this book was written, by a Kant scholar for Kant scholars, but another possibility is there's something intuitive here that existing work has failed to capture. And so we want to start by asking, where should we look for this? If people are using the logic of universalization, where might they be deploying it? I want to point out there's lots of moral judgments, like, the judgment that it's wrong to punch a person. That does not look like a very good candidate for universalization to be the key psychological motivation. That is, if I asked you, why would it be wrong for one person to punch another person? It would be weird if you answered, well, what if everybody did that? It seems a little bit beside the point. What if only one person did it? It would still be wrong. And I want to introduce a way of formalizing that intuition. We can think about what is the total aggregate utility consequence of larger and larger and larger numbers of people engaging in a behavior. And for punching people, arguably, this is a very simple function. If one person punches one other person, utility goes down a little. The more people engage in punching, the more it goes down linearly. And so there's no real difference between asking, is it bad for one person to do it? And is it bad for lots of people to do it? It just scales. The more people do it, the worse it is. But that is quite different in other sorts of social dilemmas. An example would be fisheries, where if a limited number of people are fishing, it increases utility, or at least utility is flat. You're not destroying the fishery and people are getting fish, so that's good. But once you cross a threshold, then suddenly the fishery is going to collapse and you're going to have very bad utility outcomes. We talk about these types of problems as threshold problems. The key idea being there is some threshold where enough people are engaging in the behavior that suddenly bad things start to happen. And that means that a single individual contemplating, may I fish for this many fish per day, might locally not be doing any harm, but if they applied the logic of universalization and projected what would happen if everybody did that, then in that hypothetical, it would be the global policy would be associated with harm. And so you can get distinctive predictions of a model of universalization that deviate from ordinary consequentialist thinking, ordinary thinking along the lines, what if I personally did this? Would the world be any worse? So we call these threshold problems. There's many examples. Voting is a classic threshold problem. Bank runs involve, it's no problem for me to withdraw my deposit from the bank, but if everyone does it at once, it can become problematic. Vaccination is one that we're all thinking about, obviously, a lot right now. Climate change has the structure of a threshold problem. As many of you may know, increasing carbon emissions increase agricultural productivity without major cost to the climate up to a certain low threshold, but then beyond that point, there are very pernicious utility consequences indeed. So this is a widespread problem. We've documented that people understand the relationship between threshold problems and the logic of universalization. In this study, for instance, we presented people with a number of different kinds of moral violations. Things like harm, what if one person punched another? And over on the right here, things like overfishing. And we ask them, what is it that makes each of these moral violations wrong? And we give them some candidate answers. It's wrong because it hurts a person. It's wrong because it doesn't maximize utility. It's wrong because it's unfair, or it's wrong because what if everyone did that? And we let them check off as many boxes as they want. These are not exclusive categories. But what we find is that people really like to apply the universalization specifically to threshold problems. Whereas, for instance, they prefer to apply harm-based explanations, not surprisingly, to questions like, why is it wrong to kick or punch or bite? And can apply these other categories of moral judgment also in appropriate places. But I want to point out right away that it can feel sometimes like universalization leads to an absurd conclusion. So for instance, imagine that my kids asked me, can we go to the pool today? It's a hot day. We'd like to go for a swim. And I said, what are you talking about? I mean, imagine if everybody went to the pool. It would be a disaster, 8 billion people in the Belmont deep end. So that obviously that can't be what we mean when we say what would happen if everybody did that. Rather, presumably what we mean is something more like, what if everybody felt morally at liberty to do that? As presumably we all do when it comes to swimming. And we all feel morally at liberty. And that's okay, because at any given time, most of us aren't actually interested in swimming, in particular swimming in Belmont, right? And similarly, what if everyone became a dentist? That would be terrible. But most of us aren't interested in dentistry. So it's okay for those of us who are to act on those desires. But what if all of us felt that it was morally permissible to put out as much carbon as we wanted? Well, then that really would be a problem, because too many of us have that particular interest. Okay, so we designed a series of cases, and I'll only describe one in detail, which is a sustainable fishery case where there's a little lake, there's 20 families that vacation on it, they've all been fishing in a sustainable way, but suddenly the bait and tackle shop starts selling a new hook that you can use to catch fish much, much more efficiently. And so somebody, John, is asking himself, is it permissible for me to start using the new hook? And when he talks to his neighbors, he finds out that this is a threshold problem, that if all of the neighbors start using the hook, the fishery will collapse and then nobody can have any fish. But as he talks to his neighbors in different conditions that different participants see, different numbers of neighbors express any interest in catching more fish. In one condition, only 2 of his neighbors say that they would ever be interested in catching more fish. And if only 2 people plus him do it, the fishery is going to be just fine. Whereas in another condition, all of his neighbors say that they would like to catch more fish. And obviously, it would lead to a problem if all of them did. Importantly, though, all of his neighbors in both conditions, all of his neighbors tell them that whether or not they're interested in catching more fish, they've personally decided not to because they're committed to traditional fishing methods, meaning that John knows that there will be no damage to the fishery no matter what he does. His neighbors might be interested in catching more fish, but they've decided not to. So he will be a unilateral actor. And through a great deal of manipulation checks, we assure that people understand and the assumptions going into the case. Despite that, despite the fact that John can always start fishing and he's totally confident that he's not going to harm the fishery, what we see is that nearly twice as many people think that it is permissible for him to start using that new hook. If, in principle, the 2 other interested people, if they change their minds, could also start using it without damage. Whereas in the case where if the people who were interested changed their minds and started fishing, that would lead to collapse, they think it's impermissible even for John by himself to start using the new hook. And we've replicated this not just in cases of fisheries, but across a whole variety of different sorts of scenarios. Another really simple prediction of this model is that, of course, if we take away the threshold problem, so if everybody could use the new hook and it wouldn't hurt the lake, then it should obviously not be a problem for John to start using the new hook himself. So we can contrast the presence or absence of a threshold problem. And as predicted, again, we see that this makes a great deal of moral difference to most people. We can combine those ideas by having 2 different lakes, one of which has a higher threshold for fishing and one of which has a lower threshold higher and lower threshold for the point at which the fishery would collapse in terms of the number of people engaging in fishing. And then we can put points all over this diagram. The key points here are the ones in the middle where there's an interaction between the number of neighbors who are interested and just how much fishing the lake can take. And what we see is that moral judgments track that pattern quite cleanly. And these data in particular allow us to fit a number of different, very simple computational formalizations, not just of the model that I've presented, but of the competing models that I described at the beginning of this talk. Simple versions of, for instance, act consequentialism. It's okay to do something as long as you're not hurting anybody, but if you're hurting somebody, then it's wrong, or rule following or norm following, and so forth. And we're able to show, first of all, evidence for all these other theories too. We definitely find people whose patterns of data are best explained not by universalization, but by following rules or maximizing welfare. But in the mix, we consistently find a group of 20 to 25% of participants who are quite focused on the principle of universalization. Right now, we don't understand whether that is, we just haven't tested, whether that is a consistent dimension of individual difference. And if so, what cultural or other demographic factors might predict it? Or whether most people have the capacity and tendency to engage in universalization reasoning, but don't reliably deploy it every time that they encounter a threshold problem. So those will be key topics for future research. I'm not going to be able to talk about this in detail today, but we've also tried to use our experiments to distinguish some of the subtle differences between different philosophical accounts of universalization. And so far, the ones that seem to be best supported are not the ones actually in the Kantian tradition that propose that universalization is an important moral principle because it prevents somebody from undermining the rationality of their own behavior, but rather contractarian and rule consequentialist views, which argue that universalization is important because of the consequences that your behavior has on the people around you, not just the logical coherence of your own choices. Finally, we've started to test young children. We've completed one study where we show that children as young as 4 seem to recapitulate a key signature of universalization reasoning that we had previously identified in adults. We're midway in testing a second of the key predictions of our model in children. And here we find that children about 7 or 8 years old and up are, again, recapitulating that key feature that we've identified before in adults, which just suggests that there may be room to update the really seminal work of Kohlberg and try to understand how this principle of moral reasoning emerges considerably earlier and without the kind of formal education that Kohlberg had emphasized in his own work. So that's just a very quick overview of what we've been up to. I wanted to take one more slide to just zoom out a little bit from this quick sketch that I've given you of the logic of universalization and the role that it plays in moral judgment, and to connect it with some of the themes of this conference, thinking not just about how we improve our own lives, but of course, as a moral psychologist, how do we improve the lives of each other? And how do we find equilibria, social equilibria, in which we can jointly maximize value? So, the most direct implication of the work that I presented is that not as a substitute, but in addition to this arsenal of theories that we have to explain human moral judgment, alongside a focus on consequences and rules and norms and affect, there's some role for universalization. But now and I've argued that its distinctive role might be in these sorts of threshold social dilemmas. But now what I want to do is think about the way that these different methods that people have of making moral judgments, the ones that are listed up there in the upper left, how do they interact with each other? So they've often been considered competitors. If any of you have any background in moral psychology, you'll be aware, for instance, of my colleague and good friend, Josh Green's dual process model of morality, which proposes that consequentialist considerations, utility maximization, and deontological considerations, things like moral rules, are in conflict with each other. But there's precedent in the philosophical literature, certainly, for trying to integrate consequences and rules. For instance, rule consequentialism proposes that when we are choosing moral rules, we try to choose those rules which, in general, will maximize beneficial consequences for people. And you can think about the logic of universalization as basically accomplishing that type of translation of utility considerations into a rule. What do I mean by that? Why does it matter to say, what if everybody did that? Well, supposing that we were operating with the assumption that each of us doesn't walk around in the world with our own boutique set of moral principles. Rather, the whole problem of morality is to coordinate on impartial rules. Then the natural question that arises is, well, which impartial rules should we be coordinating on? And presumably it would be the ones that maximize our mutual benefit. In other words, in deciding what to do, I am asking myself, what would be the rule governing my behavior in this instance, but also everybody's behavior in every relevantly similar instance? What would be the rule that all of us would agree to? Because by mutually agreeing to it, we would come to the best equilibrium in terms of utility or welfare. It's a really, really common theme throughout the literature on morality. I don't just mean here in psychology, but throughout the social sciences, because we know that bargaining solutions to multi-agent problems, the equilibria that tend to maximize the benefits for all interested parties and the equilibria to which they would agree, are often the ones that we see codified in explicit moral rules like laws and legislation, informal agreements between people, even in animal behavior, in the evolved, I'll use scare quotes, quote unquote, moral norms that might guide the interactions of non-human animals. What we're proposing, and here we're drawing on some ideas that were originally developed by Nick Chater, is that in the same way that natural selection favors bargaining solutions, cultural evolution favors bargaining solutions, actual literal bargaining between people favors bargaining solutions, the human mind has a model of bargaining, a cognitive model that it can use to derive in anticipation what the likely bargaining solution would be. And the logic of universalization is guiding us towards those types of bargaining solutions, putting individual cognition, and at a very quick time scale, in the role that real interactions between people on an evolutionary timescale, or on the timescale of the development of laws and institutions and cultural norms, take place. So we think about universalization as a way for people to find solutions to multi-agent problems that are relatively impartial and maximize joint welfare. And that seems like a tremendous opportunity for life improvement. So thanks very much. Thanks again for the opportunity to be here. And I hope we might have some brief time for conversation.
Thank you very much for this really fascinating, inspiring talk. We already have a number of questions in the Google Doc. But
I have to admit that I don't have that right in front of me. And if someone would be willing to play moderator in that role, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, that was my plan. I will read out questions and also give people the opportunity to raise their hand if they want to ask you in person.
Thank you.
And Brian Little is the first of those. Brian, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Great.
Hi, Fiery. That was really intriguing. And maybe this is a question that's better reserved for a one-on-one at some point. I want to adopt your perspective to that of a clinician or a counselor, or even a really good friend who's trying to advise another person about moral dilemmas she is experiencing in her life. And when I start thinking through this translation from ethical propositions from analytic philosophy to the critical case of a person making judgments about the rest of her life, I have difficulties, as did, and you'll recognize where I'm coming from, Bernard Williams, in terms of both consequentialist and deontological positions. And he would argue, as I would, that in the case of the single agent, balancing multiple moral claims in her life, we need to adopt something that is neither utilitarian or consequentialistic or deontological, neither Kant nor Can in the utilitarian sense. Do you have any sympathy with the Bernard Williams kind of approach, or is it now seen as just a cranky alternative that nobody really takes seriously?
Well, I can't speak to how it's generally perceived, but I have tremendous sympathy for Williams. I mean, one of the things that I really take away from Williams' philosophy is that there needs to be some scope for just personal preference and interest, even within the space of morality. And I think that among the predominant normative theories, contractualist, or even better, contractarian approaches are probably the best candidate for that, right? Because they allow, as kind of primitives entering into the moral calculus, just people's parochial interests, but then remind us that because we have diverse parochial interests and yet we're living in the same world with each other, we have to find some way for those to interact. So I imagine for the person on the street, if a psychologist were to propose, I think a really important part of human morality has a fundamentally contractarian nature. It involves people, it respects their, respecting their personal interests, but also trying to get along with each other. That part of the program would really resonate with the person on the street. Yeah. On the other hand, I think why many philosophers resisted Williams's view is because there's something, at least in the abstract, attractive about the idea that morality involves the kind of absolute view from nowhere, objective principles that aren't reducible to anything parochial, and certainly that you wouldn't take the view that morality just consists in whatever we all happen to agree to. And I think even the person on the street resonates with that as well. Like the person on the street doesn't want to give up on their parochial interests, neither do they want to give up on a pretty strong moral realism. Does that help at all?
It does very much so. And just one final follow-up, as it were. Williams would argue that not taking that personal ground project kind of perspective to decision making regarding your moral choices isn't just a matter of giving up your preferred viewpoint. It is a matter of an assault upon your integrity if you do not follow that. And I think he always leaves me with this question, which I've never really resolved, which is, do we say as moral psychologists or as philosophers or as personality psychologists, to hell with your integrity? What's best for most people? Well-doing has to get beyond your bloody integrity. And I'm not comfortable saying that, but it's incomplete. And what you're doing seems to be contributing a lot to unraveling the complexities of that dilemma that I think we're facing in this rather remarkable set of symposia. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I appreciate that.
Okay, and our next question is from Will Houston.
Hey, thanks so much for your talk, and I really love you bringing generalization back into moral decision making. That's great. Yeah, my question I got thinking about was sort of reversing your findings or the topics to taking issues that are positive rather than negative, and obligations to act rather than restrictions to act, and sort of the drop in the bucket problem. So something like, say, vegetarianism, where a lot of times a rationalization I hear is like, well, what's the point if I'm the only one not eating meat? It's not going to make any difference to the meat industry. There has to be a threshold of people who are doing it before I feel this obligation. Or why donate money when I'm not going to really make any difference to people's to the lives of people that I'm donating the money to. So this drop in the bucket problem might have that threshold characterization. And I'm wondering if you would find a similar set of patterns that would actually add to the robustness of your model, because you get this totally opposite domain in which to apply it.
Yeah, so I think you've put your finger on something that's extremely important, and also a real an area of underdevelopment or potentially weakness with the entire model. And so let me just restate, because I want to make sure that everyone is catching the essence of this point. It seems quite intuitive to say that if we're currently in the equilibrium where nobody is using the new hook, that it would be wrong for me to start using it if everyone using it would destroy the fishery. But now you're suggesting, let's think about a different equilibrium. Suppose we're in the equilibrium where everyone is using the new hook. We're in the bad equilibrium. Everyone is putting out too much carbon. Nobody is getting vaccinated, whatever it might be. Your theory suggests that we should all be committed to doing the right thing, even in the face of it being patently clear that nobody else intends to do the same. And that doesn't seem to resonate very well with our intuitions. I mean, we can recognize that it would be the right thing, but we don't feel a commitment to do the right thing in the bad equilibrium in the same way that we seem to feel a commitment not to be the first defector when we're currently in the good equilibrium. I'll just say two quick things about this. First, we don't have a good account for why that asymmetry exists, but I really believe that there's something psychologically real about it. Second, I want to believe, but we'll find out, that once we start to really pursue that, it's going to turn out to be the kind of one of those useful exceptions that leads you to your next big conceptual insight. That basically, I think what will happen is not that the whole theory crumbles, but that we will have a stronger and more complete theory once we understand why is it that people view those two situations so differently.
It's interesting because my intuition is not that they would be viewed so differently. I mean, I feel like I hear a lot from people. What's the point? Right. You have to reverse the dependent variable as well. And that's the issue. You see, you're using the same dependent variable, but anyway, that sounds like you're acting like a philosopher and using intuitions. Have you done the actual studies with that?
We have not done the actual studies.
Okay.
No, we haven't. But I take your point. I had never considered changing the variable. I had assumed that we would still be asking, is it an obligation that you must start doing the good thing, even though everyone else is defecting? But one way of thinking about changing the dependent variable is, look, is it at least praiseworthy?
Right.
if despite the fact that it's a drop in the bucket and it's not going to change anything and the other people are still defecting, do we still hold you out as a praiseworthy exemplar for having taken that step? There, I agree with you 100%, absolutely. And maybe that'll be maybe that'll be part of the path to building the bigger, better, grander theory. So thank you for the comment.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Thierry, and thank you so much for everyone who asked questions and shared their thoughts and comments in the Google document.